Welcome everyone to week 3, our media availability. This morning we passed our base budget bills, the Senate base budget bills. We'll address the House bills tomorrow. I have Senator Stevenson here just to give us a summary, and then any questions that you have on the base budget he could address. Any summary?
No questions. Well, I can do it. Oh, I missed the summary part. I was waiting for the questions. Yes, you know, as we've gone through this, first, it's been a great process. But the last few years, our base budget process, we have come up with a little more money to reallocate, and that we would be able to put other places. And this year, there's not much there. I think that if you look at both of all the bills as they come across, there's about $69 million, about half ongoing, half one time. That sounds like a lot. $69 million sounds like a lot to me, but if you think about it, that's $64 million one time would about replace the ag building with no bond. If you look at 35 million in one time, or in ongoing was less, just a little bit over a 1% WPU increase. It's about enough to cover the new student growth in the state. If you look at one time again, between that and a little bit for the Olympic venues, that will cover our fire suppression from last year. So there's not a lot there to work with, to begin working with, and we've got I think a real deep dig. You know, when we moved the budget from executive appropriations forward, I know we were right after the governor had shown or explained his budget to us, and what we'd come up with, technically there's about $10 million more in one-time money than we had last year. And last year we were preaching gloom and doom at this time of the year, so I'm not looking, unless we have a February surprise, I think it'll be tough lining up all the things that we're starting to see come in. I've also seen record numbers of asks for appropriations. My gosh, the number of bills is just, it's incredible, and it never ends. In fact, 5 minutes ago, we had a good Senator Davis here ask me for $5 million. So. that's just the kind of year it is right now. It seems like there are lots and lots of requests, and there are a lot of requests for new homeless programs, that things we haven't seen in the past. We'll see how this shakes out in about a month.
Thank you, Senator Stevenson. Any questions?
What about that $80 million in additional income tax revenue that's coming in? What's the discussion surrounding that? Will that be used to offset some of these additional needs, or, as I understand it, you prefer a tax cut, President?
Yeah, I prefer that because that's something we didn't expect, and it's just because of federal tax law change that we should look at ways to try and return that back to the taxpayer, not in a check, so to speak, but in at least even if it's a small tax reduction.
How's that progressing? Is someone going to carry a specific bill on that? Is that a Senate initiative, or?
We're looking at, instead of an omnibus bill, as these separate issues going forward separately, and then at the end we'd have $80 million to pick from different tax cut policies. There'll be a bill that would potentially lower the rate in the corporate and individual rates, income tax rates. There would be a bill to address maybe single sales factor as a potential. There's a couple initiatives on property taxes, which don't have to do with income tax, but and also an equalization initiative that actually generates some income. So at the end of the day, we'll be looking at all these additional potential revenues, if some of those pass, the equalization, and some of the tax cut bills, and hopefully we could take that $80 million and fund the net of all that.
Hopefully that 80 million will be, that's the high end of that tax cut is 80 million, is it not? the federal income tax thing was a scenario of different levels that we may get or we may not, depending.
Well, the different levels is based on what we do, and as I think we've expressed here before, the business tax deduction, which really brings it down from the 80 million to the 25-30 range, is really nothing that we need to do here in Utah, because we already have parity between individual and corporate income tax rates. And the reason the federal government did that is because they were lowering the corporate rate to 21%, but they weren't lowering the individual rate. And now that gives an advantage to C corporations versus partnerships and LLCs, which are pass-through entities. And since, so they made that additional deduction, but we don't need to because we already have parity. So we really do have $80 million.
Is that an agreement among the leadership of both House and Senate that we don't need to do anything on that? Because you were presented options.
We do have to change the statute a little bit because there needs to be some clarification that this isn't just going to be a deduction for everybody. That's how the commission is interpreting it. And to get into the details of that, I just don't know. You'd have to talk to Commissioner Valentine or Commissioner Rockwell. They could explain why they feel like there needs to be a statutory change for that to happen. But I think that's something that we will do.
So,
But again, is that a leadership position, House and Senate, or to? You had the option to.
Yeah, I think there's favor for that.
Okay.
I mean, has it been a position of both leaderships? Not yet, but we've had some discussions, and I think there is motivation on both sides to do something like that. Any other questions?
Yeah, do we know yet, you mentioned the requests for homeless services that we hadn't had in the past. Do we know what that amount is?
You know, they will all, I don't know what the total is, but they will all be discussed in the committees and they're strung across several committees. There's a lot in human services, there's a lot in economic development. They're just strung all over the board, these requests, and they'll be reviewed as they go through the appropriation process. But I think technically we could probably accept the House's base budget tomorrow and go home. Call it a year and go home. I'm not sure how that
There was
would look,
also some requests dealing with homeless issues in public safety, so you're right, I think they're kind of scattered throughout.
They're scattered all over, and until you can get a bunch, I think it's really difficult to know exactly what they are. But it's quite a few.
I'm sensing from our caucus at least that there's been a good effort here in Salt Lake County, and it probably needs to continue, but it needs to be a statewide effort too. But there are others in the state that are challenged with the same problems, and they want to make sure that it's not just a Salt Lake County issue.
There's been a commitment, at least by the state, subject to the process, our budgetary process, to a certain number. That number is $67 million. I think that's the number. That is a combination of state and local funds. That's going to be a high priority for both the House and the Senate. But there are some other requests out there, and they will go through the prioritization process over the next couple of weeks.
How much of that is state money, of the 67 million?
Oh, is it 20, right around, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but I think it's around $20 million.
I think if we break, I may have misstated earlier, but if we took what we're asking for the Olympics this year and the homeless commitment, that would use up the entire $34 million one time that we have, that was saved through the budgeting process. And I think you're right, it's in the low 20s.
Well, let me ask you, Senator Stevenson, given all the requests that are out there, including new requests in terms of homeless money, the Olympics, et cetera, is there a chance that there wouldn't be money available for a tax cut when push comes to shove, that maybe the state just takes that extra 80 million or a good chunk of it and uses it for these ongoing needs?
I would, that's not what the president says. And I think that's certainly part of the process that we go through here, is determining where those monies would go. But the other part of the answer to that is in the time I've been here, I've never known that all the requests have been filled either. But,
And is there a chance of that? Yes. Partially, I think it's less of a chance, all of it, but yeah, that is a possibility.
this base budget that we're
It's always a
passing puts
possibility.
$85 million back into the rainy day fund that we took out in 2010 that we've never paid back. It puts that back, and if we're in a desperate situation, then you certainly always have option of rainy day funds. But I don't think we're in a. I don't. From what I see in our economy, I don't see us desperate. So.
Senator?
I think one thing that I look at is the fact that once we see what the needs of the state are, and balance that out and get that balanced budget, and if we need more, then we know where there's some cash to be able to take care of that. And I think we need to seriously look at the needs of the state against changing tax law to alleviate or actually put more pressure on the budget.
Any questions from?
We do have 2 questions from our online viewers.
Great, I
yeah.
love it.
The first question is, why is SB 16 still circled?
Is it circled on the board?
What is 16?
Okay, we probably need to talk to the sponsor of the bill. He's the one that voluntarily circled it and has not uncircled it, and I don't know all the reasons. I think that's a great question, but Senator Thatcher, who is the sponsor, may be working on the cost of that bill. There's some fiscal implications. I know that part of the discussion is the concealed weapons permit self-sustaining? If it's generating money to the general fund, is it being subsidized? I think there's some, those questions are still being answered. I think when those get answered, then we might have an uncircling of that bill, but it's really up to the sponsor. Great question.
Awesome. And then the second question is, there are bills in the House dealing with medical marijuana, reversing the Our Schools Now tax hike, and undo the SB 54 compromise, all seeming to cut against the initiative efforts. Can you comment on the propriety or wisdom of those efforts?
Would like to take a stab at that? Senator Adams?
Sure. Generally speaking, and I've said this before, that we have quite a process here. I think my ideas are probably the best, and it doesn't seem to seems to always amaze me that I can come up with the best idea that I can possibly come up with, introduce it into a bill, and then through this 45-day sifting period, by the time my colleagues look at it and other interests look at it, it gets changed and sometimes changed significantly, and it always becomes better. The initiative process doesn't allow that. Somebody come up with a really good idea, it sits on the ballot, and it has, most of the good ideas, even all of us come up with, have unintended consequences. And some of them on the initiative process are unconstitutional, we think anyway, perhaps. And so the initiative process, I suppose, is a great process, but by far the better process is the legislative process. And I think we probably will do better at solving some of these problems if we just have a little time. And I surely appreciate those that have brought forth the initiatives, but I think it's better for us to deal with it as a legislature.
Senator Davis?
I think the initiative process is one of those issues that frustration with the general public wanting a solution to a problem that we've refused or have not addressed wholly. And so they're taking it upon themselves to try to get the signatures that they need to put it and force the issue by doing that. Force us to make a decision.
I think it was last week, I don't know if it was Thursday or Friday, we had a discussion about this, and so you go online, you can see the discussion we have, but it's very hard for a legislature to try and change what the people have done by initiative, and so, but we know already, even from the people who are offering up the initiatives, as Senator Adams said, that they've acknowledged that there might be some difficulties that would need to be corrected in the future. But there's no question, because of the focus that we have on these issues, that we completely concur with what Senator Adams talks about, that if at all possible, these issues would be better solved through a legislative process versus an initiative process.
And we're working on them.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
I wasn't here last week, Lee was, so I don't know. Did you cover the redistricting initiative last week in that conversation?
Not specifically.
Okay, and Senator Adams, I was going to ask, because you mentioned you guys might view some of these initiatives as unconstitutional. Is that one specifically that you view that way, or?
Yeah, I think it may be. I've walked down through them. I think that is one that may have that type of a problem to it.
And is the leadership or anyone in the legislature discussing a bill that would have to do with redistricting or that initiative specifically?
Senator Okerlund went through it last time, and he went through the process, but from what I remember of it, it was, Utah did a phenomenal job. People looked at it, and it was the effort and the technicality of it were, I think, unmatched. And I think maybe there were people who were frustrated, but you did a really good job at trying to make sure there was as much balance as there possibly could be.
Sarah?
Yeah, there are a few redistricting principles that have just been found by the courts continually over the past several decades that are very important to the process. One of those, probably one of the most important of those, is that you have uniformity in the number in each of the districts. And we spent months last time in the redistricting committee going out into each of the counties, each of the districts, listening to people on what they thought. And so they were actually able to, in that process, be able to tell us what they thought. We asked them to draw maps, which is really difficult when you're trying to have a continuous number of people in each of those districts. But we asked them to draw the maps and show us what they like, and then try to make all of that fit with some of the legal principles that are out there. And so I think when it comes right down to it, there are some other ways to do those kinds of things, but there are going to be some constitutional issues, and they would have to be addressed either in the process, either in the initiative process, or by the legislature, either before or after. So we were one of 2 states in the last redistricting process that weren't challenged. And I believe it was because we went out and listened to people and gave them every opportunity to draw their own maps. And we incorporated a lot of what they thought and what they drew and gave to us. So it's a big, complicated process, and isn't something that you can just do overnight.
I'm a little confused about the constitutional issue with the redistricting commission that's being proposed by initiative. So my understanding is it's independent, but it's also only advisory, that the power still stays with the legislature.
It comes back to the legislature, but if you have an initiative and it comes back to the legislature, it's going to be hard for the legislature not to say, oh, this is the will of the people. And so, yes, we would have an opportunity to refine it at that point in time, but that takes some time and some certainly some effort and some expense. But I think that we had a great process in the last redistricting process. I've heard people say there was gerrymandering. I didn't see that. I actually didn't see that. I saw people very engaged in the process, and everywhere we went, we got people who gave us maps and said, this is what we think. We tried to keep communities intact. We tried to get the numbers as correct as possible. And I think on our congressional districts, we were down to a number of 1. There was one vote difference in those districts. We did it a lot in our legislative districts as well. So it's a great process. It's a great question. There are those who have thought there might be a better way to do it. We'll see.
But again, how is that, I can see why there would be political pressure having an independent group challenge what you're doing, but why is there a constitutional issue there?
Well,
Actually.
I think you'd have to look at the decisions of the courts all the way down through from 3 or 4 redistricting cycles, which is where the courts usually weigh in on those kinds of issues. And if the Supreme Court ends up making the decision what the lines are, then they certainly have a lot of say. But so I think you have to look at the thing in detail, and we haven't done that yet. There will come a time when I think we will have to do that, of course.
And last from me
I
on this.
think the one thing that we do is we rely on the one person, one vote ruling. That's really what we look at. Sometimes, and one of my concerns, we don't look at geographics so much, urban versus rural. Kind of the unwritten rule in there is the fact that we want our representation to represent all parts of the state, instead of having a congressman, for an example, that represents the largest urban areas in the state and be able to address those issues without being influenced with other issues. That's one of those issues that are there. And I think the Supreme Court is moving forward on looking at some of the other issues, the partisan issues of redistricting. And so that'll be interesting to see how that comes out. I think the initiative is a good form. Salt Lake County uses a commission to put theirs together. And it hasn't dramatically changed the balance of power in Salt Lake County either. So those are issues that need to be looked at. And if we get the initiative, I'm quite sure that it'll work out. If there's a constitutional problem with it, it'll be addressed.
So we need to wrap up. If you have any questions, we're happy to take those separately. Was there one more question?
We have 2 more actually.
Okay. We're probably going to have to address them tomorrow. We apologize, but please tune in tomorrow and we'll address those questions. Thanks, everyone.